Kia ora koutou. Welcome everybody. Ko Frianwadia toko ingoa. I am the founder and chair for NATINA, Neuroscience and Trauma Informed Network Aotearoa. And this is our first korero for the year. And we are really excited to have Elen Nathan with us. I'll get us going with the karakia and then introduce Elen. So welcome. Karakia te matanga. Manakitia tēnei hui, manakitia tēnei ropu, manakitia tēnei whanau. Tai noa ki tainei kaupapa. Arahina nā korero, arahina nā papai. Arahina nā ture nei, ia puta ai te maramatanga. Amine. So bless this meeting, bless this group, bless this family as we come together for this gathering. Guide the discussion, guide the questions, guide the intent so that we move on to greater understanding. Welcome. So we've got Elen with us today. Elen is an occupational therapist, and Elen has worked with children and has a really deep understanding of the sensory processing challenges that our children face. And she uses a trauma-informed lens when engaging and working with our kids and families as well. And so we've got lots of interesting questions for Elen today, but I would like you to give the opportunity, Elen, to just talk a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself. You've got your own practice called the Playful Place. So yeah, tell us a bit more about, what you do and a bit about yourself, and then we'll get going with the conversation along the way. So welcome, kia ora.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So yeah, I'm Elen. I am an occupational therapist. I have a private practice which is called The Playful Place. I'm based in Ahuriri, Napier. I did my undergrad in New Zealand at AUT University, and then somewhere between that and having my own children, spent a lot of time in autism services and working in that neurodivergent community. Then when I had my own son, he was born at 29 weeks. So he was born premature. So he had that developmental trauma of being born really early. And as I was holding him in the hospital or waiting 5 days to hold him because, he had to be in an incubator for a long time, I was kind of struck by how much I didn't know about prem babies, despite having worked with them for a while. He wasn't quite able to be seen by OTs at the hospital because he was born at 29 weeks, which was old enough to not reach the threshold for that service. So I just asked for some books around occupational therapy and prematurity. And as I was reading the books, I kind of realized that what I was reading was not what I was seeing in practice in front of me. And I myself, being a clinician, didn't know a lot of what I was suddenly faced with learning. And it started this whole other trajectory towards understanding sensory from a developmental trauma lens and thinking a lot more broader than just at that stage, it was more about autism and ADHD for me. And then it broadened out into all the other conditions, including prematurity and all the types of different ways that people can experience trauma and the effect that has on the sensory systems. So fast forward a little bit, I felt like I knew a bit about sensory, but still not enough to really understand why I was doing what I was doing. I knew how to place a strategy. I knew how to place an accommodation. I knew how to observe a child in need and see the sensory pieces that were missing, but I didn't quite know why I knew that or how I knew that. So I went on to do my postgrad at Sheffield University in the UK. It's not a qualification you can get here in New Zealand, so I had to look abroad. And did my postgrad in sensory integration, and then got really deep into the neuroscience of sensory and understanding it as the process, whether you're looking at a sensory concern at the receptor site or the sensory concern that's embedded in the brain, which would be kind of like when trauma has affected the sensory systems, and the processing pathway between the two. How does sensory information travel from the body to the brain? And just spent 3 years really digging into all of that. So now I'm an OT and a sensory integration practitioner, and I feel like I understand sensory inside out. So I understand the theory, I understand it in front of me as a parent, I understand it in myself, and I love it. And I think there's a lot to share about it.
Amazing. Gosh, that's quite a journey, Ellen. I
Mm,
think sometimes I think it is often our kids that teach us and sort of
mm,
take us down these pathways of,
100%.
going further and learning and growing in sort of the spaces that we
Mm,
already sort of are working. And I love how you've made those links about you knew what you were doing, but you didn't know exactly why
mm,
or how to replicate. And I think that's so important because if we are to be able to pass on, that information and get others on board, to practice alongside us, then we need to have that understanding, knowledge, and skills, isn't it, to be able to
mm,
really articulate and sort of communicate all of that. Look, that is absolutely interesting. I didn't realize about that personal aspect of yours,
mm,
in terms of how that sort of deepened your understanding. Um, Tell me a little bit. You've spoken about developmental trauma and you've
mm,
talked about how, the sensory integration processing through the developmental trauma lens is something absolutely new now. Most of us listeners will know and understand what developmental trauma is, but for those who don't, can you just share a little bit? I know it's, trauma that is experienced in the early years.
mm.
And just, yeah, expand a little bit on developmental trauma and the links it has to sensory processing. Why is it so important for us to understand
Yeah.
that aspect?
So I'll try and cover that, but if I
Yeah.
only cover half because I forgot half, just jump in and go, and this other bit.
All good.
But yeah, so developmental trauma, it is exactly as you said, it's trauma experienced in those early years, and usually situated around rupture in relationships. So it can be trauma experienced in utero. So it might be, for example, a parent who is experiencing domestic violence and the child is therefore experiencing that domestic violence while in utero as well. It also acknowledges trauma before conception, so it might be intergenerational trauma. It can also be things like, for me as a mum who had a prem baby, my second child went on to start coming around 24 weeks. But at that stage, I knew what that early birth was, so I got put on bed rest to keep my second child in, and we managed to keep him in. But bed rest
Mm.
has an effect on the unborn baby because you're not moving. I was very stressed and worried about him.
Yeah.
So that in that utero environment where he was nesting and getting ready,
Mm.
had some stress involved in that too. So I was keeping my child safe, but in the process of keeping him safe, he still experienced higher levels of stress in utero than other children might. So
Mm.
developmental trauma is, yeah, what affects baby in those early years, but it doesn't always mean that it's something malicious. It might be medical trauma from a child that's born, you know, unable to breathe and has a lot of medical intervention in place, and the rupture between mother and child, and mum feeling really stressed as well. So trauma comes in many ways, but I think we need to
Yeah.
hold
Yeah.
space and understanding for it also coming from care sometimes for our children. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I
Mm,
think, we often sort of think about trauma as, the big sort of abuse or incidents that might happen that,
mm,
cause trauma. But like you've said, there's so many other sort of experiences that may be well intentioned but can cause trauma. So neglect
absolutely.
is one of them. And,
Hmm.
I often think as a parent who has three children with sort of, needs, and my oldest two have extremely high needs. Many years
Mm,
ago, I remember my mother telling me when, my kids were little, she said to me, she said, why don't I take the little one for, a few months and look after him while you focus on your
mm,
older one? And I remember back then I said to her, I was very annoyed and I said, I can look after my own child. Like, you don't have to, no ways am I gonna let my child go. But my mom said to me, she said, do you see, look at yourself. You don't have any time.
Mm,
for this second child of yours because you focused so much on your first child who had high needs,
mm, mm,
my oldest was autistic. He had surgery done at the time because he was profoundly deaf and stuff. And I didn't
mm,
realize. But now when I look back, I actually say, my second child was the neglected child. And of course,
mm.
there would have been impacts, in the early years for him.
Yeah,
And it wasn't because I was, willfully neglecting him. It was because I was just didn't have
so
the
focused.
capacity, isn't it? So I
Yeah.
think you're absolutely right in that sense. We don't realize how many experiences, unknowingly can cause trauma.
Mm,
I see the
mhm,
same thing happening, for adults as well. You don't realize, you don't label it as trauma, but yeah, it is trauma. And it's so important that we understand, what's happening, what's going on.
mm,
Um, Ellen, tell me a little bit about how, as adults, can we be really more mindful, okay, and recognize the sensory challenges that some of our neurodivergent or disabled students might be facing? Um, Sensory trauma is a real thing for a lot of our
mhm,
neurodivergent and disabled students.
mhm,
And we don't have within homes, within schools, we don't have a really good understanding of, the sensory needs of our kids. And so tell us a little bit about, sensory trauma and what do we need to be aware of to prevent
mm,
it? And how can we sort of be more supportive, through that sensory lens for our neurodivergent
mm.
disabled children?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing just to land is that we have 9 senses. That's the way that I coach it here in New Zealand. So most people know about the five, which is kind of the five that we grew up on, which is taste, smell, hearing, sound, and touch. And those are the most common that people know about. And then there's 4 extras, and they are internal senses. So those first 5 are more about the environment outside of us. What does it look like? What can I see? What can I hear? It's the environment. So those are also sometimes called the environmental senses or external senses, external to ourselves. The internal senses are interoception, vestibular, proprioception, and neuroception. And so those 4 senses are more about what's happening in my body and how do I feel about that. So proprioception, the receptors are in our muscles and our joints. So anytime we're moving our body, we're getting proprioceptive feedback. If you don't have that feedback, you may be experiencing your body a little bit like a ghost, like you can't really feel where your edges are, you bump into a lot of things. And that can be really scary because you're falling over a lot, you're knocking over friends' things at school, you're getting in trouble a lot for being clumsy, or it's embarrassing, it's shameful that you're a 10-year-old who's still tripping over or can't catch a ball yet. So sometimes the trauma may not directly come from the sensory system or the experience from the
Mhm.
sensory system, but it might come from the effect of having that sensory challenge. Like I fall over in front of my friends so often that I'm now too embarrassed to run in public, for example. Um, so that's proprioception. Interoception is the sense of what's happening inside my body organs and what I need to create comfort. So that's, is my bladder full and I need to go to the toilet, or is it empty? Am I hungry? Am I starving? Have I eaten enough? Right down to, are my eyes giving me a message that I'm tired and I just need to close them now? So any organ inside our body gives us some feedback. But again, not everybody has that. About 20% of the population don't get internal messages from their body. So they don't get the early signs, for example, of a rapid heart rate,
Yeah.
or their lungs they might be breathing faster. So if we have a rapid heart rate or our lungs are breathing faster, that's often a sign of either excitement or anxiety. If you
Mhm.
don't feel those early signs inside your body, chances are you are frustrated, you are scared, but
Yeah.
you don't know until it's too late and you're exploding and you're getting in trouble at school for always being that kid that explodes or hits somebody or um, ruins other people's artwork or comes in from recess really high wired and hurts self or others.
Yeah.
If we have a behavior plan, for example, in place that talks about making good choices, taking a deep breath, walking away,
Mhm.
being a good classroom citizen, being a good following our values and rules of our school, that's all lovely information, but it means nothing if you can't feel your early signs of frustration. So
Yeah.
now we've got a kid who's being punished or going into or being shamed because their name's on the board or they're not getting ticks like everybody else is.
Yeah.
They're not being bad. They may just not feel their early signs of stress. So, I've spoken to some people that talk about how they have a massive list of strategies. They know exactly what to do. They just have no idea when to do it. And
Yeah.
by the time they need it, it's too late and they've hurt a friend. That's really traumatic. When you are at school and the expectation is that you'll get a sticker or a reward or a principal's award for following school values, but you have no idea how to keep yourself regulated to follow that school value, then you sit back going, I don't belong here, or you try your very best to be quiet and good, but actually inside you're bubbling, calm isn't a baseline for everybody.
Yeah.
Not everyone feels safe when in a calm state. For some people, calm feels really unsafe. So if we are asking our kids to sit in a classroom in a calm, quiet state, and that feels unsafe, then we're not creating a sense of belonging, and that's really overwhelming and traumatizing for them.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because when I first started sort of learning about regulation and the nervous system, um, before I had really gone into more depth, I always believed that calm is the regulated state. When we say
Mm,
regulated means
mm,
calm, and that's not the case, isn't it? The
no,
regulation is dependent on what you're doing, where you are, your
100%.
own self, your own nervous system, and the environment around you, and what's
Mm,
needed for you to sort of, I guess, function in that
mm.
environment, isn't it?
The
So,
way I explain it is that regulation is about matching the task you're about to do. So if you are sitting doing quiet reading, then regulated for quiet reading might look like a quiet, calm body.
yeah,
If you're about to start your running race and it's cross
yeah,
country, regulated might be a pocket of energy ready to explode at any minute so that you can run that race.
yeah,
If somebody sneaks up on you at night when you're walking down the street, regulated is yelling, biting, screaming, fighting.
yeah,
So if you're
yeah,
under attack,
yeah,
being regulated to the attack is I'm going to fight you back if I feel like I can survive. So yeah, exactly that. Regulated is not calm. We're using the words for the wrong thing, and it's giving kids confused messages.
and sets up the wrong expectations. And as you say,
Mm,
then it leads to that
mm,
sense of I'm a failure, I'm not able
mm,
to sort of, live up to these
mm.
expectations.
And it leads to
Um,
dysregulation,
yeah,
but it's the environment and the expectations that is dysregulating the child. It's
yeah,
not the child is dysregulated. It's not their fault for being dysregulated. It's that the expectations don't match what they can give.
yeah. Can I ask, you've talked about sort of the different senses and everything. Now, Linda's put a question about when kids start in the early years, and some of them don't have enough of those early play experiences or sensory integration experiences. What does that mean, and how do we know that some children might require more of this? As they're beginning school, and what can teachers do about it? How can, first of all, teachers become aware that this child needs more of, sensory experiences or sensory integration, and then what do they do about it?
Yeah, I'm just writing some of those points down. Um, I think we need to be a little bit careful with this answer and a little bit careful with this question. So I'm just going to talk
Yeah,
around it a little bit. So, some children don't have as many sensory experiences as others, and that's quite right. And sometimes that might be due to, for example, a very busy family and a very busy dynamic, and the child might, for example, have excess use of screen time, and for every hour on the screen is an hour not outside playing, right? And there's many reasons why we have more hours on screens than we do in play, right down to less siblings. I grew up with 6 siblings. There was
Yeah.
5 people to ask, will you play with me? No. Will you play with me? No. Will you play with me? No. Will you play with me? Yes. Great. I've got
Yeah.
a play partner. Whereas today we often only have a few siblings, so there's less chance of play.
I
It's not
think
all down to parents.
culture also plays an important role, doesn't it, Ellen?
Mm,
And I know for some
absolutely.
cultures, messy play is not okay, and you've got to be neat and tidy and clean. I know I grew up that way,
Yeah.
and so for me, messy play, when I first started as an early childhood teacher, sort of, getting into it, it was a unique experience for me. And it was
Mm,
something, um, that took me a while to really let go and just enjoy it, if you know what
yeah.
I mean.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a task, it was the experience. And I think for me to get to the stage where I could experience it and really enjoy it,
Mm,
took a
took a
bit of
while.
time. So yeah, so
Yeah.
culture plays a big role as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And I think
Mhm.
also sometimes we might see a young person or a student or a child who's not engaging in a lot of sensory play.
Yeah.
And that may be because that sensory input does not feel safe for them. So if you've got a
Mhm.
child who doesn't want to
Yeah.
touch paint, who doesn't want to touch slime,
Yeah.
that might be because for them that feels incredibly unsafe and incredibly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So in those kind of circumstances, we've got to take it really slowly. And there may be some older kids and teenagers and adults that still don't want to touch certain textures and certain experiences. So when you see a child who you feel has not had a lot of sensory experience, we've got to start to just quickly ask why. Do we
Mhm.
feel like if we gave them exposure to a lot of sensory input or a lot of play input, they would enjoy it? Or
Mhm.
when they get that exposure, are they not enjoying it? And if they're not enjoying it, pull back a little bit because we
Yeah.
always need to come from that place of playful exploration and joy
Yeah.
and a sense of safety. So, yeah, I think sometimes we need to go a little bit slow.
Mhm.
If you notice that they're not enjoying the input, like they don't like wet texture, then just start with dry.
Yeah.
You can do messy play with powder paint rather than wet paint, or
Yeah.
you can take the wet paint and heat it up in the microwave
Yeah.
and make it warm paint. And you might discover that it's not that it's wet, it's that it's cold. And once it's warm, they may love to play with it. So
Mhm.
within that sensory piece or that within the play they are avoiding, try and task analysis that and figure out what is it that they're not enjoying. And then we build enjoyment not through exposure of that thing, but actually just taking the stress out of it a little bit, make it a little bit more drier, make it a little bit less, there's play
Yeah.
with paint inside a bag before you play with paint on your hands. Just figure out what is hard for this child and honor and respect that, have empathy for that, and then pull back, pull back, pull back until you get to a space of comfort for the child. And you're
Mhm.
like, okay, this child will play with paint when it's water paints, or this child will paint with paint when it's blue, but they won't play with red.
Yeah.
So you stay with blue and then you slowly change that.
Yeah.
Start from comfort, start from
Yeah.
safety, and build out
Absolutely.
from there.
One of the things that I have often done over the years, even in my EC sort of days with kids, was I always said, if kids are exposed to something new, anything new can be stressful.
Mm,
And so if they're exposed to anything new, make sure that I give them something familiar. So if I
mm,
had to introduce something new, a new texture, new, material, I would
mm,
try and make sure, either they had a favorite color there, it was enough, something that
mm,
they preferred, or they had sort of, something that made them happy and comfortable and feel safe. So it's so important to make sure we're um, keeping the space for that safety throughout
mm.
those explorations, isn't it?
Yeah,
Really, really important.
absolutely.
So the next question I've got for you is,
Mm,
are there any simple, easy to use tools, resources for teachers and parents who do not have access to an OT? I'll share the link you've shared with
mm,
me. I will share that. But I also want to know, what do you do? How do you go about it? If you don't have access to an OT, where do you
mm.
start? What do you think you should be looking for? Or, what's your sort of advice for somebody who's trying to start exploring the space of understanding sensory processing
Sensory,
and
yeah.
for our children? Yeah.
So I think, yeah, a couple of things. So sensory isn't just or shouldn't just be protected by OTs. So every human has a sensory element. We've just often got that role and have specialized in that role. For example, sensory integration post-grad qualification, that is only open to occupational therapists, physiotherapists, and speech and language therapists.
Okay.
So you might find a physiotherapist that's a sensory integration practitioner.
Yeah.
And I know of two here in New Zealand, for example. Um, and lots of physios have quite a lot of sensory knowledge, but not the sensory modulation, sensory trauma piece, because they're more
Yeah.
about the body and how it's processing its input than perhaps OTs who have this real psychology, clinical, what's happening inside the mind piece as well.
Yeah.
There's an OT that works really closely with Bruce Perry over in America. Her name's Marty Smith, and she specializes in sensory trauma. And she explains OT in the trauma space as OT is like anatomy plus psychology. That's the space an OT inhibits, is that we know a lot about the body and anatomy, and
Yeah.
we know a lot about psychology and what happens in the mind. And so we're that blend between the brain and the mind. So
Yeah.
that's where sensory trauma and sensory fits really nicely for OTs, but it's not only OTs. You might also have some psychologists that have sensory knowledge.
Yeah.
What most psychologists I work with and I know of, and when I'm presenting around New Zealand, lots of them will say, I know a bit and I can certainly do a sensory assessment, but I'm not quite sure how to interpret it. I can't put an eye on a child and go, yes, that's a processing difficulty of the proprioception sense, for example. So people hopefully know their limits, but it's not just about OT. If you are wondering whether you're working with somebody that has some sensory concerns, there are some spaces you can go. So there's a website called Sensational Brain, and I've given you a link to, they have a downloadable free
Yeah.
screening tool, which screens all the sensory systems except for interoception and neuroception, but all the other ones. And it just asks you questions. Do you observe this? Have you noticed this? And you tick it or you don't tick it. And then it tells you if you're in maybe the hypersensitive, which is very sensitive, or hyposensitive, which is low, meaning you're not really getting that sense coming in quite so much. And so that's a really lovely tool that's free. It's very good and very
I've just
robust.
put that in the link, so
Yeah.
add it there.
If you are a teacher or an ECE teacher or a clinician, obviously you need consent to be using that screening tool on any of
Yeah.
your children, because you are collecting data and you are observing them in a slightly different way. So start that conversation obviously with the family, but it's a
Ellen,
nice place to start for free.
quick question. With
Mm,
the screening tools, is it
mm,
essential that you do the screening across settings? Because often our kids tend to sort of not generalize.
mm.
And so they may interact with different settings in different ways. So they'll sort of do certain things at school, not at home, or at home they'll do certain things which they won't
Yeah.
do at school. So do you think it's essential that when you use screening tools, you should screen at home and at sort of, the
For me, it
learning
depends on
space?
the purpose. It depends on the purpose
Okay.
of the tool. So if the tool is to get a diagnosis, then yeah, we want to screen across multiple environments to make sure it's not heavily about an environment. But even if it is about an environment, that in itself is a good piece of knowledge to come out with. But if it's just about getting a picture of how this child is coping with their sensory systems inside this space, say
Yeah.
an ECE or at home, then it would be okay to have that one person doing that screen. Yeah,
Yeah.
depends on the purpose of the screening tool.
Okay.
There's also, if you don't have access to an OT, but you're kind of interested in the world and you're a teacher,
Yeah.
I can send a link to this, but this is a really good book. This is one of my favorites. It's called The Why Behind Classroom Behaviors,
Yeah.
by Jamie Shaves. And they've got really, really good, all the sensory systems, how it impacts on learning, how it impacts on handwriting, what is regulation, what is a sense of safety. And it's the paradigm shift from top-down behavioral approaches to relationship-based, brain-based, trauma-informed approaches. So that's a really good book if you are just wanting something to reference, and it has like common behaviors you might observe, and
Yeah.
it gives you what's happening underneath that, or gives you that lens
Yeah.
to look at. There's a lot of self-reflection in here too. It asks you to really reflect on your own practice and what you're doing. So that's a really good book. And I think there's also I've sent you a link for an environmental audit tool,
Yes.
which is from Autism Scotland.
Yeah.
And this is a tool that is used when you're just trying to figure out, is your environment, whether it's home, school, a clinic, a hospital room, a GP's room, whatever it is, have you thought about all the sensory components in this space?
Yeah.
And so it's things like, it asks you questions like clutter on the walls. You know, a lot of the big issues in classrooms is there's so much information on the walls. And so it asks you to check, what do your displays look like? You know, is it really clear that this topic is inside this border and that this topic is inside this border? And when the child is looking you, teacher, at the front of the class, what does the whiteboard behind you look like?
Yeah.
What's framing you? Because if they're attending to you, but behind you is all this information,
Yeah.
that's really hard for a sensory sensitive person to process.
Yeah.
So that's a environmental audit tool, which most OTs are trained in just walking into an environment and doing a very quick scan and audit. But this is a lovely checklist that you can go through.
Fabulous. Look, that's some really helpful resources. So I've put the links for those resources in the chat,
Mm.
and I have also right at the top of the chat added the two sheets that you've got around the internal sensory systems and the external sensory system. So
Mm.
that's there.
Thank
Now, one of the things that we wanted to know was you've already touched briefly on it, sensory sensitivity causing trauma.
you. Hmm.
Sometimes it's not the sensory experience itself, sometimes it is how others react and respond to you in terms of, your needs.
Mm. Mm.
But purely sensory experience, is that something that can cause trauma? Because we've all often heard a lot of autistic voices say that certain sounds make them feel, you know, pain. Or I
Mm.
know personally when I hear scratching on the board, it just really sort of, gives me the heebie-jeebies and I cannot stand it. It, really makes me unnerved. But that's one thing. I know some people don't want to touch something. My son, when he was a baby, for years actually, he would not touch a soft toy. And, he would literally move away. You could see he'd sort of, back off and refuse to touch a soft toy. And I had so many soft toys for him as a mother. And it took me a while to realize and understand that, he's not comfortable with it. And I had to back off, and finally he did sort of, become comfortable with it. But it took him years. So does the sensory sensitivity always cause significant trauma or a adverse physical sort of, reaction of pain or discomfort? Does that vary? And how do you know, especially our kids, if they're not able to articulate really well?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. So does it cause trauma? Yes, it can. So if we think about trauma as being the memory that sits inside the nervous system, and that
Yeah,
it's not about, trauma is not about the event or the thing,
yeah,
it's about how that nervous system responds to that.
yeah,
So some people have had a sensory experience that has caused a traumatic experience for them,
yeah,
which then they go on to be traumatized by. Yeah. So I think about some of the people that I work with, they have pre-verbal memories, for example, of being force-fed pureed food between 6 months and a year, um, and feeling sick and vomiting and gagging and still having to do it. I work with some teenagers who remember being held down and having their teeth brushed, and they are super sensitive orally. They're on a beige diet, they're eating less than 10 foods. they were always that way. When we look back from birth onwards, there was always oral sensitivity,
Oh,
but the parents didn't know. They had a child that was refusing to brush their teeth. We absolutely know you have to brush your children's teeth twice a day. So they did whatever they could do to keep their child's mouth and teeth safe, which sometimes was holding them down, restraining them while they brush them. So now I work with some people that find it really hard to be in a bathroom, find it really hard. The smell of mint makes them repel, and it's all back to those experiences, which became traumatic
yeah,
because of, for them, often it was not having the autonomy, the body autonomy to say no, to move away, those sorts of
yeah,
things.
yeah,
So, yes, having a sensory processing difference
yeah.
inside your body can cause traumatic experiences when your autonomy to say no and your ability to say no or is taken away from you. Yeah,
Okay, that's really
definitely.
interesting, Ellen. I never quite thought about it from that sense about the loss of autonomy and
Mm,
agency uh,
mm,
related to a sensory experience.
mm.
So that's really, really interesting.
Yeah. And other things can happen, like, if I'm thinking about a young person who was in a shopping center and the shopping center had a fire alarm and it was so loud they just dropped to the floor. It felt like knives in their ears. And they were, picked up by the emergency services and taken out because they couldn't get themselves out. And they can't enter a shopping center again because it's just too unpredictable for them. And this is a couple of years later. So that's a really clear traumatic response to a sensory experience. Yeah. So
So this is sorry, I'm going off
that's right.
because I'm really intrigued now.
Mm,
The sensory sensitivity,
mm,
where does it where does it start from, so to speak? I know the
mm,
individual sort of that's when we first start having our sensory experiences. But where and how do these sensory sensitivities sort of um, emerge, or where are they embedded? Where do they begin from, so to speak? I
mm,
understand, they exist, but often what is it um, that starts out? Because some of us have you know how we say we've got a high threshold and low threshold for
mm,
pain, and we've got a high sort of sensory tactile or vestibular seeking sort of, need, and others sort of will avoid it. So where do these sort of levels get set? How are they set,
Look, I try and write down all your questions, and the list gets longer and longer. There's so much in there to unpack. I love it.
Absolutely.
Great question.
Absolutely.
And you know what? All this highlights is actually how complex sensory is.
It
So I
is.
love your
It is.
questions because often we go sensory, seeking or
Yeah.
avoiding, full
Yeah.
stop,
Yeah.
or sensory, fidget aisle and Kmart.
Yeah.
Or sensory, it's swings and weighted blankets, and it's
Yeah.
just so much more than that. And
So much.
anyone who says sensory is simple or sensory
Yeah.
is easy or I understand sensory, I just think, woof, do you?
No.
Because it's pretty complex.
Yeah.
So, really cool question. Um, Look, where does it start from? That's a really hard question to answer because it can start from so many things.
Yeah.
Some people are just genuinely born with a sensitivity to life. And that's not a bad thing. And that's not necessarily due to any traumas or any stresses. They just have more sensory input than other people. They
Yeah.
experience more sensory input than others. So, a couple of the words that you used, you talked about seeking versus avoiding. So, that's more of a behavioral lens across sensory. Like, what can
Yeah.
I see to work out what's happening? And it's really useful and really helpful
Yeah.
for teachers and basically for people outside looking in, going, what might this child need?
Yeah.
A very quick way to assess the situation is, are they seeking more of something? And if they are, give them access to that unless it is at risk. For example, they're climbing, power poles and they're going to get electrocuted.
Yeah.
They're seeking climbing, which is vestibular,
Yeah.
but maybe not a power pole. Let's find that child a tree to climb, for example.
Yeah.
That would be seeking. Or maybe they're seeking just they just want to play in the sandpit all day. Every other child spends an hour and moves on to paint or moves on to playing families. This kid's just in the sandpit all day. We might refer to that as sensory seeking of sand, which is tactile input and proprioceptive input. Sensory avoiding is the opposite of that. They're pulling away from something. So um, we can seek or avoid due to being sensitive, highly sensitive, or have a lower sensitivity to. And sometimes we think it's one when it might actually be the other. So I'll just tease that out a little bit. So, for example, you might have a child who is sensitive to sound. So they may cover their ears to avoid an assembly, or they might wear headphones when they're in a shopping centre with their parent because they're avoiding input. But sometimes they might seek turning the music up really loud, or they might hum and hum and hum all day long, and you might see that as seeking auditory input or seeking sound. They may be seeking sound to avoid sound. So they're seeking their own sound because it's predictable and they have control of it and they know when it's coming and they can turn it up or down as a way of avoiding the background noise that they can't control. People talking, teacher talking, announcements over the radio in a supermarket.
Mhm.
So sometimes the seeking, historically, we referred to if you're seeking, it's because you're under responsive and you want more to feel the world. And if you're avoiding, you're over responding, so you are avoiding. Whereas now we've gone, actually, no, that's not
Mhm.
always the case.
Mhm.
Sometimes we seek to avoid
Yeah.
or we avoid to seek.
Yeah.
So it gets really complicated,
Yeah.
basically, is what that boils down to.
Yeah.
The threshold you talked about, so sensory threshold and pain threshold. So pain
Mhm.
is a sensory experience taken through the tactile sense or
Yeah.
the interoception sense. So pain is sensory as well. We do have a threshold, and what that means is that there's a certain amount we can tolerate
Yeah.
before we can't tolerate it anymore. So there's a certain amount of sound I can tolerate before it's too much. There's a certain amount of um, uh, tactile input. Like I might
Yeah.
like being in a sandpit on a sunny day, but not on a cold day because now the
Yeah.
sand is cold and heavy.
Yes.
So my threshold is breached much faster because
Yeah.
it's too cold for me.
Yeah.
So the threshold is about how much of that thing can I tolerate?
Yeah.
And our thresholds change.
Yes.
So what you can tolerate at 9 o'clock in the morning, you might not be able to tolerate by 3. So it can change. It's dynamic. Mhm.
Absolutely. And I think that's something to be very aware of, isn't it? Because sometimes, like you say, we think we know about the sensory, preferences or needs of a child,
Yeah.
but they change. And if we are not really responsive and aware of these changes, about how a child loves this one day, but not another day, or, and
Mm,
we're not really
mm.
analyzing what's the difference from today and, 2 days ago when they absolutely loved it, you miss out on really understanding, those complexities of their sensory needs.
Yeah,
It's so
absolutely.
important to be observant. I've always found, really being observant
Mm,
and not presuming. I think that's one of the key
mm,
things, like not presuming, oh yeah, I know this is what I know, so this is what it means, but
yeah.
rather really exploring, what am I seeing?
Mm,
How's the child sort of, behaving,
mm.
reacting is so important.
Observant and curious,
Yeah,
it's exactly that. Don't shut down and think that you know this child. And
yeah,
often what happens in New Zealand, unfortunately, is that even if a child has had access to a pediatrician or a OT or a team that
yeah,
has said, right, this child has sensory whatever, sensory
yeah,
disorder, sensory difference, sensory needs, sensory kid, all the amount of ways I hear it explained across medical
yeah.
letters is incredibly varied. That's not enough. That's still the umbrella term of this child has sensory needs.
Mm,
So, sensory processing disorder, if I was to use that word as a diagnostic criteria, there are about 16 subcategories.
wow.
So, there's sensory processing disorder, that's just the umbrella term, that's like
Mm,
neurodivergence.
yeah.
Underneath that is sensory motor disorders like dyspraxia or VBIS. And then there is sensory discrimination disorders, and then there's sensory modulation disorders. And a child might have, three different sensory modulation challenges and a sensory discrimination challenge.
Yeah.
Um, or they might have just one, or they might have five. So sensory processing disorder as a diagnosis is helpful, but it is step one.
Yeah.
It's like, but what? And if you don't have
Yes.
access to a clinician like me that can drill down into the
Yeah.
subcategories,
Yeah.
even just a bit more information of, and it looks like this. They have
Yeah.
sensory processing differences, and it looks like I
Yeah.
don't like wet things. I don't like cold days. I don't like wearing sunscreen.
Yeah.
That's enough to have a bit more of a picture.
Um, a couple of questions. So one is, how do we use positive language? How do we use strengths-based approaches? Uh, when my son was really little, I remember always understanding the sensory processing needs as sensory processing disorder, like you said.
Mm,
Um, I think, he's now 20 years old. I know there's a lot of shifts in terms of approaches and
mm,
language and how we, value our kids with differences. What would the appropriate strengths-based language and, ways of referring to sensory processing differences be? And the other thing is, I would love for you to explain to our listeners the difference between sensory discrimination and sensory modulation, and then the sensory integration that needs to happen.
mm. Okay. So strengths-based language, I think your safe language at the moment is sensory difference or sensory profile. This child's sensory profile is.
Mhm.
Sensory difference, I still think it's not strengths-based enough if you're
Yeah.
being really purist because you're still saying different. Different to what? This is my normal. So
Yeah.
that's where it's like my sensory profile is I don't like to eat red meat. My sensory profile is I don't like wet things. If I'm
Yeah.
saying the difference, then I'm saying I'm different to probably everybody, which is still singling me out.
Yeah.
Um, I still use the word disorder because there's quite what I'm seeing a lot of at the moment is a lot of the 20 to 40-year-olds
Yeah.
coming to me for diagnosis who have a history of a lifetime of anxiety and depression and stress and difficulty in relationships and those sorts of challenges. And when we do their sensory profile, they have huge sensitivities, but it's been used against them. Like, you're so sensitive, don't worry about it, or you're so difficult, or you have such emotional dysregulation. When I work it through with them and say, look, I'd like to write this up for you as what your profile is, what language do you want me to use? A lot of them say disorder. They say, actually, I want my doctor to see that this is a sensory processing disorder and that someone sees it, or I want my mum to see that this is a clinical condition.
Yeah.
They may change their mind over time, um,
Yeah.
but yeah, there's still a space.
Yeah.
Clinically, where we use that term is when we're really trying to help funding. For example, if you're trying to access NASC funding, you might refer to it in that diagnostic criteria space, which is the medical model, which is not what we use for our everyday understanding of differences in people, but it is helpful in certain spaces. So for me, sensory processing disorder is what I'm using if I'm trying to get funding or access or a deeper understanding. And we only diagnose that when the sensory differences or challenges are impacting on function. When I can't eat because of my sensory differences, when I can't go to school because I can't cope in the classroom, I can't hold down my job anymore because the warehouse no longer sells my brand of socks and I can no longer wear my work boots. Like, real life story happening with one of my clients at the moment. So then it becomes that kind of clinical space. Outside of that, there's a whole lot of sensory difference that might not need an OT, might not need any accommodations or adaptations. It's just about knowing me, what I like, what I don't like, and how do I live my best sensory life. When I'm working with people who have really had a rough time and have experienced kind of a lot of trauma because of their sensory needs,
Yeah.
what I find is the first patch of time is just trauma work, just
Yeah.
holding safe space to explore what are your memories, what do you like, what do you not like. It's not uncommon for me to be in a darkened room with a client with my back to them while they just don't want to observe my face and they can't be in bright lights and they're not wearing shoes and socks and we're just holding space and there's no noise or there's white noise out the door, while they're just trying to get safe in the environment and feel settled and not overwhelmed. So the first patch is just that trauma work. And then the second patch is, what are your triggers? What is hard for you? Let's figure that out. And
Yeah.
then the third stage, which is the, most lovely stage if you get to stay there long enough, is the glimmers.
Yeah.
These are your sensory challenges, but what do you love? I
Mm.
work with a young person who can hear a tui
Yeah.
in the next door's garden. So I have a home-based clinic, and she will say to me, "Oh, the tui's coming," and I'm like, "The tui?" She's like, "Yeah, the tui. It's about 2 gardens away," and I'm like,
Yeah.
"Okay." And then we carry on talking, and then she's like, "Oh, he's nearly here." Carry on talking. 5 minutes later, there will be a tui that will land in my garden
Yeah.
and do this beautiful song in my harakeke bush.
Yeah.
She's heard him gardens away, and she can tell that he's coming closer and closer.
Amazing.
So
Yeah.
we capture that as a glimmer. I'm just like, gosh, you knew he was coming. In my head, I'm also like, man, you're hearing
Yeah.
3 houses around me. I have quite a big yard and she can
Yeah.
hear for so far. Whereas I couldn't even hear the tui in my own garden. So there's so much noise there that she's taking on board, but the glimmer is she knows the tui's coming before anyone else. So we try and focus. So sensory well-being, living a life of sensory well-being is what I'm aiming for with my clients. But I know that I have to start in, how has life been for you? Probably not very nice if you're seeing me. What are the things that aren't making it nice? Let's understand that and let's get rid of those. And then, what do you love? What is the experience of drinking a hot chocolate for you? It's probably way more exciting than for other people. So we
Yeah.
lean into our sensory joys, and now we have lifelong sensory well-being because we're learning to lean into the sensory joys. Mm.
I absolutely love that concept of sensory well-being, Ellen.
Mm.
And I think, what you've said makes me think about, filling our bucket and
Yeah.
how important it is for us to find the sensory experiences that fill our bucket for all of us, really.
Mm.
Um, valuable to look at it in that way through that lens of the, sensory input we get from around the world.
Mm.
Um, can I quickly ask, what do you think, how does sensory processing impact our nervous system? We've talked a lot about it, but also emotional regulation. How is
Mm.
it linked to the emotional regulation? Um, I know you've talked about memory. You've talked about how sensory memory can sort of, impact
Mm.
with regards to sort of trauma and in the nervous system,
Mm.
sort
Mm.
of sensitivity and how it can impact the nervous system. What about emotional regulation? If we've got obviously a dysregulated nervous system, emotional sort of response and interaction with the world, behaviors, it's all going to be impacted. What can we be doing in that space to really understand those links, make
Mm.
sense of them, and then support the emotional regulation, through sensory experiences for our children?
Hmm. Okay. So I think where we started was, how does sensory processing impact the nervous system? And so it's just that knowledge we have now of the brain. Just go back to what Bruce is telling us. Bruce Perry, Nathan Wallace, Beacon House, all of these places that are integrating our knowledge of brain development and what we know now. So the brain develops bottom up, starts in sensory motor, shifts into emotional attachment, and then
Mhm.
we've got that cortex and thinking.
Yeah,
So the brain develops in that way, which means that from birth,
yeah,
we are driven to respond and act on the information our senses give us.
yeah,
So if you have more sensory information coming in than others,
yeah,
then you've got more to process, which means that it's got to go through the senses first, and then it goes through our emotional system and our attachment and relationship systems, and then
yeah,
it goes into our thinking brain. So we can't really act on our sensory system if, or we can't think about acting on it if so much is coming in at once that it hits our emotions first. So thinking is the third step. So you're very lucky if your brain is operating in a way where you get to think about what you're doing. Most of our people, it's just the sensory information comes in and it is so overwhelming or it is so big or so often that we're just straight into that emotional space and we get stuck there. And so now we're just sensory emotional, which is what dysregulation is. My
Yeah.
senses are on fire and I'm emotionally dysregulated and I cannot access my cortex
Yeah.
to be able to think this through and make a different choice, like take a deep breath. You can't breathe deeply when you're in survival. You know, your body is saying, breathe fast, move fast, move fast. So, yeah, a lot of our regulation strategies, we come at them top down. We come at them like you can think about it, but it doesn't work. So, bottom up brain development means bottom up processing, means bottom up responding. So,
Mm,
we need to respond through regulation first, relationship next, and then reasoning through what happened and could you make a different choice next time or could you prepare for this? So, um, relating is about empathy. Just honor the experience the person is having and just get into that space with them. Like if they are really upset and they can't breathe, there's no point telling them to take a deep breath. You've just got to take a deep breath with them, get down to their level, try and regulate them through co-regulation. If you are regulated, they will regulate. That's what the neuroscience is telling us the most at the moment, is that co-regulation matters. And a dysregulated adult can't regulate a dysregulated child. So you've got to regulate yourself first and then co-regulate that person. I think that because so much more comes in,
yeah.
we've got to hold space for me, a sensory 101 is remove before you add. So,
Mm,
so often our sensory strategies are add a swing, add a weighted
mhm.
blanket, add some fidgets. Actually, sometimes we're just adding to the problem. So
Yeah.
before you go adding in these lovely, sometimes gimmicky things that make us feel good and look good, I've done something. Look, I've
Yeah.
bought a fidget toolbox.
Yeah.
Awesome. But before you put a toolbox of fidgets in your classroom,
Mm,
please clear your walls. That's what's
yeah.
going to make the difference. It's
Yeah.
not going to look as awesome. It's not going to be Instagrammable, but it's actually going to be better for the person at the center of it. So the first thing is reduce clutter.
Yeah.
Reduce sensory clutter to reduce overwhelm, and then add your fun bits on top.
Yeah.
Fidgets, there's a lot of science behind them now. They are really good for ADHD brains. They are really good for concentration supports. They're also really good for dissociating in the classroom. Some kids just need a brain break, and sometimes that means I am going to look at my fidget and I am going to stop listening to you because I can't take anymore. Your voice is croaky today. I can hear a tone in it that I'm not used to. That's making me feel really stressed. I'm getting really worried that you're not going to be here tomorrow because I can already hear that you're sick.
Yeah.
I just need to focus on my fidget tool. Sometimes we think fidget tools distract kids and that's a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we need to tune out for a bit.
Yeah.
But before you give that fidget tool, the biggest thing you can do is reduce sensory clutter first. So before it becomes a space of overwhelm,
Yeah.
before it becomes a space of feeling like it's too much,
Yeah.
take away everything you can and then add support. The fidget tool can be sometimes, if all we're doing is adding in fidget tools in a classroom, for example, it can be a little bit like turning up to a car crash with a box of plasters. It'll do something, it'll do a little bit of something, but it's not really dealing with the real cause of
Mm,
the problem. It's not enough. The
yeah.
big picture is clean up the mess, clean up the clutter, reduce sensory overwhelm, and then add those extra bits.
Thank you for that, Ellen. You've put it really, really beautifully. And as the years have gone by, my sort of, I was like that. I used to keep looking at what do I do to help myself? And now I look at what do I take off my plate to help
Yeah,
myself? What do I
yeah,
need to cut back or let go of? Really, really interesting how you said it. You've got to reduce that sensory clutter to reduce the sensory overwhelm. It's so simple, and
Mm,
yet I think we miss it, don't we? We keep
yeah.
looking at what do we bring in, what do we add, what do we
Mm,
look, this has been really, really helpful. I have put in all the links to some of the information that Ellen has sort of shared, documents. So it's all there in the chat, and we will put it up on the Facebook page as well in a few weeks' time. But I just wanted to say, look, thank you so much. You have provided so much rich information, useful information for us. Um, I know our hour is up, but I do have one last question because there's a question in the chat, and that is about spitting and biting. When
mm,
children have the oral motor sensory sort of need to chew or bite, or pinch. I remember my son used to pinch. Actually, this takes me back to the days when my oldest son needed to bite, and he needed so badly to bite, he would bite the wooden furniture
mm,
in the house. Like he really needed it. All the chewies would sort of be bitten through in no
mm,
time, and we had the toughest silicone chewy that was available at the time. And I remember he would just end up finally, trying to bite on. And so, what do you do with that kind of stuff? Because that often can lead to harmful behaviors, either they're sort of self-harming or sometimes harming
mm.
others. Is there anything that sort of, we can be doing to support our kids with that intense need?
Yeah. So I think you'd want to know when, where, and why, right? Like when are they doing it? Where are they doing it? And why are they doing it? Sometimes we're not going to know why they're doing it, especially if we're still following like there are
Yeah,
four functions to behavior, avoidance,
yeah,
and that kind of stuff that's a bit
yeah,
gone, hopefully. Um, but observe how they're biting and what they're biting. So
yeah,
if a child is biting with their front teeth and they're nibbling, that's very different to when we're biting with our back teeth and we're chewing. So that front bite, if you give them even just a pen and they're nibbling at the edges versus if they're putting it in there and chewing on something,
yeah,
then the front chew is more tactile and the back chew is more proprioceptive. If they're biting themselves and others and it's going into that category of harm, then
yeah,
sometimes that can be that situation where I am seeking to avoid. I am biting to get either a pain sensation that lets me avoid the thoughts in my head or the pain in my tummy or something else. Sometimes a lot of biting in our non-verbal community can have something to do with pain in my teeth. So the first thing when you see an increase in biting is actually go check the dentist, try some pain meds, see if the biting reduces
yeah,
on pain meds,
yeah,
because sometimes the biting is indicative of pain somewhere else
yeah,
in the body. Um, if there's a lot of chewing, then
yeah,
let them chew, just replace it with something safe. If they're biting and swallowing, then that is pica, which is I eat non-edible things. If they're biting and spitting or just biting, 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 then that's proprioception seeking most of the time. Look at the bigger picture, go, pull out, get a bit, don't get a spotlight on the bite. Go, what else is going on? So if they're biting and they have a really beige lunchbox filled with soft foods, which is totally okay. I am not talking about nutrition and I'm not shaming lunchboxes. But if you notice that none of that food is chewy, they are currently not getting a lot of chew input through their food. We are biologically driven to learn how to chew and get regulation through chewing. But for some of us, chewing is too hard, or the texture of the food is too hard, so we can't chew the food. But our nervous system still knows that across the day we should be chewing something. So sometimes that if you notice a desire to chew in a child that's not eating chewy foods, sometimes it's if or a desire to bite. Sometimes if you give them chewing gum, for example, they get if they'll take it, or high chew if you're worried they'll swallow it, but there's also no harm in swallowing chewing gum. Um, then they're going to get the chew proprioceptive input that they're not getting from their food, and you might notice a slow trail down of no longer biting things. Um, our oral whole situation, chewing, sucking, swallowing, this is our first regulator. You know, when we were born, we had the ability to feed, whether it was bottle or breast or chest. And so there was this connection. Biologically, we're driven to be soothed through jaw action and food and swallowing and all those things. So we often return to that when we're stressed. We bite our nails, we smoke a cigarette, we drink from our water bottle, we drink copious amounts of tea, coffee, or wine. It's all seeking regulation through the oral system. So sometimes it's just helicopter up or pull out and go, what else is happening about either I can't access my oral system as other people are, so maybe I'm missing something there, or maybe it is a stress response and I'm trying to get regulation. And then just feed the need. If you see it, find a way to replace it, acknowledge it. Gosh, you're biting, but I think that might hurt your hand. Can we try something else? And sometimes it might be proprioceptive input they're seeking. The only way they can do that is through biting their hands or biting whatever they're biting, but actually a jump on the trampoline and regular proprioceptive input through all the proprioception heavy work might be really beneficial because that's what they're seeking, not necessarily biting through the jaw, just muscle and joint input. And that's proprioception. And that's probably enough of an answer. Do you agree? Oh, I can't hear you. I've lost you.
Oh, look, this is the best answer ever I've had. I'm so glad I asked that question, even though we're over time. You've put it so well, and it's so important, like you said, to zoom out.
Yeah.
Over the years, I've often looked at things, but I've kind of looked at it from one lens, or like you say, could it be proprioceptive? Could it be pica? Never really looked at everything and then gone, okay, let's analyze all of these bits and pieces and
Mm.
what it could be. So it's absolutely amazing how you've put it together. I will close us now. Thank you so much for this fabulous korero. There's lots of comments in the chat saying thank you so much. It's been absolutely fabulous. Really, really do appreciate it. Look, before I close us with the karakia, were there any last parting words that you wanted to share with our listeners today?
Um, just live your best sensory life. If you love something, go for it. If you don't like something, pull away from it. It's okay to not enjoy everything. And if you're working with people with sensory differences, you don't have to understand it to believe them. You just have to show empathy, and that's enough. So just empathize with the experience, even if you don't get it. Just go, gosh, for you, this is hard, or for you, this is fun, and just relate to that experience for them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ellen.
Welcome.
I'll close us with the karakia. Karakia whakamutunga. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumie, huie, taikie. So restrictions are moved, so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities. Kia ora, thank you very much for coming along and joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our next korero. Ko Marie.
Thanks, Ellen.